The evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as James parked his car in the driveway. His suburban home, with its pristine white picket fence, stood as a symbol of the life he had worked tirelessly to build, a life of comfort and stability. But as he stepped inside, an unsettling silence greeted him. Something felt off. The faint scent of alcohol lingered in the air, mingling with the sweetness of a vanilla candle long extinguished. Dropping his keys onto the counter, James called out Laura. His voice echoed in the quiet house, but there was no response. Unease prickled at the back of his neck as he moved into the living room, and that's when he saw her. Laura lay sprawled on the couch, her blouse slipping off one shoulder, her skirt bunched up around her thighs. An empty wine bottle lay on its side near her bare legs, the red liquid staining the carpet. James froze, his heart pounding. "Laura," he said again, his voice faltering as he stepped closer. Still she didn't stir. Panic gripped him. Was she hurt? Kneeling beside her, he shook her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. A lazy giggle escaped her lips. "James, you're home," she slurred, a grin spreading across her face. The carefree tone was so out of character that it sent a chill through him. "What happened? Did you drink all this by yourself?" he asked, gesturing to the bottle. She didn't answer. Instead, she let out another laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "Today's a special day," she sang, her voice lilting with drunken amusement. James frowned. This wasn't the Laura he knew. Composed, sharp, reliable. Something was very wrong. "I'm taking you to bed," he said firmly, sliding his arms beneath her. He lifted her effortlessly. She felt light, her body limp against his chest as he carried her upstairs. She hummed softly, her head resting against him, as though oblivious to his growing concern. When he laid her on the bed and pulled the covers over her, he turned to leave. But her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Wait," she said, her voice low, deliberate. James turned back to face her, his brows furrowed. "What is it?" Her lips curled into a smirk, and her eyes gleamed with mischief. Then she spoke words that turned his world upside down. "Today my boss had me in our bed," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. "And it was amazing." James froze. The air seemed to leave the room, and his mind struggled to process her words. What did you just say?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Laura laughed again, the sound cruel and mocking. "You heard me," she said. "By the way, my boss has a huge Johnson, and he knows exactly how to use it." For a moment, James couldn't move. He felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. He stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say it was some twisted joke. But she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes, a satisfied smile playing on her lips as she muttered, "Best day ever," before drifting off to sleep. James sat down on the edge of the bed. His eyes locked on her sleeping form. Her smug expression lingered, even in slumber, as if she were reliving her betrayal in her dreams. A storm brewed inside him, a tempest of disbelief, heartbreak and seething rage. "How could she?" he muttered under his breath, his fists clenching until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to convince himself that it was the alcohol talking, that she didn't mean it. But the smirk, the deliberate cruelty in her tone, it all felt too real. "Wake up, Laura," he said sharply, shaking her shoulder. Her eyes flickered open, and she groaned in annoyance. "What now, James?" she mumbled, sitting up slightly. "Can't a girl have a little fun? What did you say downstairs about your boss? Tell me it's not true," he demanded, his voice trembling. She chuckled, hugging a pillow to her chest. "Oh, James, don't act so surprised. You've been working late every night. What did you think I was doing while you were gone?" "Knitting." His heart shattered. "You're serious," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You actually, with him? In our bed?" She shrugged, her smirk returning. "Yeah. And it was amazing. You know, he actually pays attention to me, unlike you." James felt his world unraveling. Every memory, Their laughter, their promises, their life together, was suddenly tainted. He couldn't understand how she could be so callous, so indifferent. "How long?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Does it matter?" she said, leaning back against the headboard. "Let's just say it's been going on for a while. And honestly, James, he's so much better than you. In every way." Her words were gasoline on the fire of his fury. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as he forced himself to stay calm. He knew losing control wouldn't help him now. "You're unbelievable," he said, his voice icy. "I've given you everything, Laura. I worked late to build a life for us, to make sure you had everything you needed. And this is how you repay me." Laura rolled her eyes. "Spare me the pity party, James. Maybe if you'd been around more, I wouldn't have needed to find someone else." James stood. His fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. He couldn't listen to her anymore. "Sleep it off," he said coldly. "We'll deal with this in the morning." As he turned to leave, she called after him, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't be such a drama queen, James. It's not like you're perfect." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Every fiber of his being was focused on holding himself together as he walked out of the room and closed the door behind him. Downstairs, he sat alone in the dim living room. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. His anger was no longer raw. It had crystallized into something far more dangerous, calculated. He stared at the empty wine bottle on the coffee table, his jaw tightening. "She thinks she can humiliate me, destroy our life, and walk away without consequences," he thought. A grim smile tugged at his lips. "Fine, Laura. You've made your choice. Now it's my turn." James pulled out his phone and opened his email. Over the years, he had kept track of everything. Documents, shared accounts, passwords, even details about her work. He wasn't one to micromanage, but tonight, every piece of information would serve a new purpose. James sat alone in the dim living room, the silence heavy and suffocating. The ticking of the clock echoed in his ears as his mind churned with thoughts of betrayal. Laura's words replayed in his head like a haunting melody, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. The raw anger he felt earlier had now crystallized into something far more dangerous, a calculated resolve. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, and began to map out his plan. If Laura thought she could destroy everything they had built together and walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. James was determined to dismantle her world piece by piece, ensuring that her betrayal would haunt her for years to come. James crept upstairs with deliberate precision, entering the bedroom where Laura lay sprawled on the bed, snoring softly. The smug, satisfied smile still lingered on her lips, and it filled him with renewed disgust. Her phone rested on the nightstand, glowing faintly from a recent notification. Without hesitation, he picked it up, knowing her passcode by heart. The device unlocked with a quiet click, and James began his search. It didn't take long to uncover the evidence. An endless string of flirtatious messages, explicit photos, and plans made behind his back. The texts with her boss, Richard, were nauseating in their boldness. "You looked incredible in the office today. Couldn't wait to get you alone. James working late again. Perfect. See you tonight. Last night was unforgettable. I can't stop thinking about you." James's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep scrolling, capturing screenshots of everything. Then came the photo, a smug Richard lounging shirtless in their bed. His grin a taunt that ignited a fire within James. Returning to the living room, James powered up his laptop, his expression cold and unreadable. He accessed their shared bank accounts, scanning the transactions. Expensive dinners, lavish gifts, hotel stays, items James hadn't purchased. The betrayal deepened with every receipt. Laura had used his hard-earned money to spoil her affair. With steely determination, he locked her out of their finances. He changed passwords, froze credit cards, and transferred their savings into his personal account. She wouldn't see a single cent of what they'd built together. Not anymore. Once he secured the finances, James drafted an email. The recipient list included Laura's sister, who had always been protective and outspoken, and several of Richard's senior colleagues. He attached the damning screenshots, ensuring the evidence spoke louder than any accusation. The email to Laura's sister was brief but devastating. Thought you should know what your sister has been up to. She's been cheating on me with her boss, Richard, and even brought him into our home. Let's talk tomorrow. The email to Richard's company was more formal, exposing the affair and attaching proof of misconduct. He hit send, the satisfaction of action dulling the ache in his chest. The next day, James meticulously prepared for the evening. He arranged a dinner at their home, inviting Laura's closest friends and family. She would arrive thinking it was a surprise for her, but James had other plans. When the guests began to arrive, Laura was her usual charming self, laughing and mingling, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. James observed her from a distance, his calm exterior masking the turmoil within. As the evening progressed, James decided it was time. He stood at the head of the table, raising his voice just enough to command attention. I need to address something, he began, his tone steady and measured. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. Laura looked up, confusion clouding her face. What's going on, James? She asked with a nervous laugh. Why don't you tell everyone, Laura? He said coldly. Tell them about Richard. Her smile faltered. What are you talking about? James didn't reply. Instead, he pulled out his phone, displaying the incriminating screenshots. He held it up for everyone to see, his voice laced with quiet fury. This is what she's been doing while I've been working late to build a life for us. Flirting, sneaking around, and bringing him into our bed. Gasps filled the room as the guests leaned in to see the messages and photos. Laura's face drained of color, her earlier confidence dissolving into panic. This isn't what it looks like, she stammered, her voice trembling. Really? James countered, his gaze unwavering. He swiped to the photo of Richard in their bed. Explain this, then. Laura's voice cracked as she tried to defend herself, but no one was listening. Her friends and family stared at her with a mixture of shock and disappointment. James, please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness. A moment of weakness. James repeated, his voice rising. It wasn't a mistake, Laura. It was a choice. A deliberate choice you made over and over again. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Laura sank into her chair, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. As the guests exchanged murmurs of disbelief, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the notification, a response from one of Richard's colleagues. The email confirmed that Richard had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. James allowed himself a grim smile. The man who had so arrogantly invaded his life was now facing the consequences. Back at the table, James turned to Laura one last time. You thought you could betray me, humiliate me, and still walk away unscathed. You thought wrong. Enjoy the life you've chosen, Laura, because it won't include me. With that, he walked out of the dining room, leaving Laura to face the wreckage of her choices. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her lips trembled as if searching for an explanation, but nothing could undo what had been revealed. James stood before her, his voice steady and resolute, cutting through the silence like a blade. You've lost it all, Laura, he said, his tone devoid of emotion yet heavy with finality. You've lost me. You've lost your dignity. And now, you're losing everyone who ever mattered to you. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating. Laura's eyes darted around the room, seeking some form of support, but all she found were faces filled with shock, disappointment, and quiet judgment. Her sister, standing at the edge of the room, was no exception. She had been silent throughout the confrontation, her expression unreadable until James turned to her. "I thought you should know what kind of person your sister really is," he said, his gaze unflinching. "She's been lying to you, to me, to everyone." Her sister's face hardened, her voice soft but firm as she replied, I didn't know. "I'm sorry, James." James nodded slightly, acknowledging her response, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. He wasn't doing this for pity or sympathy. He had already given Laura everything. His trust, his love, his loyalty. She had shattered it all. Laura's tears began to fall freely now, her once confident demeanor crumbling into something fragile and pitiful. James looked at her, but there was no trace of the man who had once adored her. That part of him was gone, replaced by a quiet, cold determination. "I'm leaving, Laura," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "And I'm never coming back. I'll take everything, including my dignity, and walk away. You're on your own now." She tried to speak again, to plead, to beg, but James had already turned his back on her. His footsteps echoed as he walked out of the room, leaving behind a broken woman and a room full of people who would never see her the same way again. That night, James lay awake in his new apartment, the silence pressing down on him. For weeks, he had been consumed by a need for revenge, driven by anger and betrayal. He had exposed the truth, humiliated Laura, and destroyed Richard's reputation. Yet, as he stared at the ceiling, he felt no triumph. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness where satisfaction should have been. He replayed the events in his mind, the tearful pleas, the gasps of disbelief, the look of despair on Laura's face. He had thought that revenge would bring him closure, but now, in the stillness of the night, it felt like an incomplete victory. The weight of everything he had done lingered, heavy and unshakable. For so long, his life had revolved around his anger, his need to make Laura and Richard pay. Now that it was over, he was left with a question that haunted him. What comes next? The days that followed were filled with both reflection and change. The consequences of James's actions rippled outward. Richard, suspended from his position, was under investigation. His once pristine reputation was in tatters, his career hanging by a thread. James had succeeded in bringing him down, but instead of satisfaction, he felt a strange sadness. He hadn't just dismantled Laura's life. He had torn apart others' lives as well. Even if they deserved it, the destruction left a bitter aftertaste. James began to focus on himself. The apartment he had moved into was small but refreshing, a blank canvas for a new start. He took long walks through the city, letting the noise and chaos around him drown out his thoughts. Slowly, he rediscovered pieces of himself that he had forgotten in the midst of his anger. He joined a local photography group, picking up a camera for the first time in years. He found solace in capturing quiet moments, the play of light and shadow. He started painting again, allowing the colors to spill across the canvas, expressing emotions he couldn't put into words. On weekends, he volunteered at a shelter, finding unexpected comfort in helping others. Friends who had stood by him through the storm became his anchor, reminding him of the value of genuine connections. They encouraged him to open his heart again, to let go of the bitterness and fear. Tentatively, he began dating, taking small, cautious steps forward. Each new interaction was a reminder that trust, while fragile, could be rebuilt. Months passed, and James found himself walking through a park one crisp morning. The city was alive around him, bustling with energy and life. He paused by a bench, watching children play and couples stroll hand in hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled, genuinely, without hesitation or pain. He had stopped looking back. The betrayal that had once consumed him was now a distant memory, a scar that reminded him of his strength. The road ahead was uncertain, but it no longer frightened him. "Here's to a new chapter," he whispered, the words carrying a quiet determination. That evening, as the sun set and bathed the city in golden light, James sat on his balcony, sipping coffee and reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had let go of anger, of revenge, of the need to look back. What mattered now was the life he was building, a life of peace, purpose, and hope. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. With the sun dipping below the horizon, James stood, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow might bring.